Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those who are watching us from the other side from the pond. My name is Thomas Renard. I'm the director of ICCT, the International Center for Counterterrorism, and a senior associate fellow with the Egmont Institute. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all for this live briefing on spreading hate, the global rise of white supremacist terrorism. This event is part of a series of joint events that are co-organized by ICCT and the Egmont Institute. We had a first joint event earlier this year on the rise of jihadi terrorism and ISIS, more specifically in Africa, and we will have still at least one other event later this year or earlier next year. Maybe a quick word on these two institutions. ICCT is a think tank that was established in 2010, specifically with the mission to contribute to the international discussion debate on terrorism and counterterrorism, and to basically work towards more effective evidence-based counterterrorism policies and practices grounded in human rights and the rule of law. We are based in The Hague in the Netherlands, but we are a global think tank with a network of associate fellows, notably worldwide. The Egmont Institute, to which I am associate as well, and a former fellow there, is a think tank that is based in Brussels, and that covers more broadly international security issues, of which terrorism is one focus, and they also contribute to the Belgian and international, European specifically, discussion on these issues. When it comes to ICCT specifically, I have to say that right-wing extremism and anti-government extremism are two specific issues that we are increasingly prioritizing in our work, in our research, and we have identified them, these issues, as cross-cutting priorities for the coming years, because indeed we do believe that there is a strong need and necessity to focus more on these issues. Indeed, there is growing concern among security services in Europe, in North America, with more attention being given to right-wing extremist ideology, groups, individuals. That translates into more arrests in many countries, in more individuals being monitored by these security services, whether law enforcement, whether intelligence. That also translates in several countries into more prosecution of individuals related to right-wing extremism. And so basically, again, a perception that something is on the rise there, even though it is not clear yet whether this is really becoming the main threat, extremist or violent extremist threat in Europe at the very least. But there is a clear sense that it is a growing one requiring more attention. Of course, in the United States, it has been identified as the main threat. And from a European perspective, January 6th represents the culmination of this threat to our democracy, with big question mark as to whether we should prepare or anticipate something similar to happen on this side of the world. But there's also many more aspects to right-wing extremism, aspects that are maybe less spectacular, such as the mainstreaming of ideas, which are equally, if not more concerning for democracy, even though maybe less spectacular than terrorist attacks. And then, of course, there is the broader theme of anti-government extremism, which is also identified as a growing concern by many security services in Europe, which partly overlaps with right-wing extremism, but it also is different in several aspects. It's also a very broad term. It's not always very clear what we put in that under that label, anti-government extremism. It is not entirely clear what the connections are with right-wing extremism. Sometimes it overlaps, sometimes it doesn't. And it is not entirely clear what the risk this movement really poses to our society. Is it more a form of new radicalism within the framework of democratic societies, or is it really a form of extremism leading potentially to violent expressions? But more than ever, we need to look into this phenomenon. We need to look into its causes. We need to look at its evolution. We need to look at the link between far-right politics and far-right violent extremism. And of course, far-right politics is also something that has been gaining more grounds in Europe over the past decade. We need to look at the transnational aspects of this phenomenon, which is why it is also so important in the context of this live briefing to have Daniel Byman with us to speak from a US perspective, but also having in mind all these transnational aspects, and also how can we respond to this rising phenomenon locally and internationally. So there was no better speaker, we think, than Dan Byman to speak and to present his book, but also his research on these topics. And it is my pleasure to welcome him on behalf of ICCT and the Egmont Institute. But before I give him the floor, this discussion will be moderated by Dr. Barbara Molas, who joined ICCT recently. She is a research fellow within the Current and Emerging Threats program at ICCT, and she's done a lot of research on right-wing extremism and conspiracy theories. So it is my pleasure to give Barbara the floor so that she can moderate the discussion and introduce our speaker. Barbara, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Very generous interaction. Yeah, it is my pleasure indeed to introduce our speaker today and his new book. Professor Daniel Byman is a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, where his research focuses on counterterrorism and Middle East security. He's also a professor in the Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Services Security Studies program. And previous to that, Byman served as a staff member with the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States and joined 9/11 inquiry staff of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Prior to that, Byman was a policy analyst and the director for research in the Center for Middle East Public Policy at the RAND Corporation and worked for the US government. And obviously, he's also author of Spreading Hate, The Global Rise of White Supremacist Terrorism, his most recent book published by Oxford University Press. A very important contribution to the field, Spreading Hate examines the evolution of white power movement around the world, explaining its appeal and the threat that it poses, as well as the many failures that it's gone through. The book addresses key moments in the white power movement's evolutions, particularly in the United States, but also around the world, and then details its many facets today. Considering policy solutions as well as synthesizing a vast body of scholarly research, the book is an essential reading for anyone worried about an increasingly networked movement that threatens to grow more dangerous in the years to come. So before we continue, a couple of house rules. Participants are not allowed to speak or unmute themselves during the event, but they can post questions in the chat. And after the book launch, these questions will be addressed during the Q&A. Participants are also invited to keep their videos on if they wish to do so. And at the end of the webinar, participants are kindly invited to reply to a short survey, which may help us improve the quality for future events. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to our speaker. Thanks so much, Professor Byman, for joining us today and presenting your latest book.
Thank you so much for having me today. I greatly appreciate the warm welcome by Thomas and also by Barbara. And let me also thank everyone at ICCT and Egmont for having me speak today. So when we think about white supremacist violence and terrorism, for me, this really began in 2011 when we saw the attack in Norway by Anders Behring Breivik, where he does a large bombing at a government center, and then a mass shooting at a political camp for left-leaning youth in Norway. And this, in many ways, is the model for many attacks to come. And we saw a very bloody decade, really around the world, from white supremacist attacks. I'll name a few of the ones that received more attention, although there are really many that did not get the attention it deserved. So the 2015 shooting and killing of 9 people at a Black church in the United States by Dylan Roof, the 2017 rally of Unite the Right in Charlottesville, Virginia, where 1 people died, shooting at Pittsburgh Synagogue in 2018, where 11 people died, a horrific attack on 2 mosques in New Zealand where 51 people were killed, El Paso Walmart shooting targeting the Latino population, attack on a synagogue in Halle, Germany. And with these numerous and repeated attacks, we see a proliferation in the number of far-right groups. There are more in the United States than there have been in many years. As Thomas mentioned in his introductory remarks, security services around the world are focused on this problem and warning of the danger it poses. In the United States, the FBI director, the Department of Homeland Security singled out this kind of violence as a top concern. And simply if you look at death tolls, it's going to vary, of course, around the world. But in the United States, which has focused on jihadist terrorism linked to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, in the post 9/11 era, the death toll from white supremacist violence is roughly the equivalent of jihadist violence on US soil. So tremendously consequential. And today I'm going to talk about the nature of the movement, its strengths and weaknesses. I'll talk about its global dimensions. I'm going to discuss the role of social media in some depth. I'll make some brief comparisons with jihadist terrorism and then wrap up by talking about counterterrorism. But I do want to begin with a little bit of history. My book has a lot of history, but that's not the focus of my talk today. What I would say is that for most of history, and here I'll emphasize in the United States, but we see echoes around the world. Often the terrorism in the name of white supremacy was not seen as necessary simply because the system itself was racist. So you had laws, you had social mores, you had a set of structures in place that were designed to keep, in the United States, Black Americans, but Muslims in Europe, others outside the mainstream of the social, political, and economic system. And there was a particular focus in many places, I'll emphasize in the United States, on anything involving physical contact. But the law itself often guaranteed white supremacy. And we saw the emergence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, which at times shows up, at times disappears, that it emerges when there's a threat to white dominance. So after the American Civil War, there's a brief 10-year period where there's an emphasis on Black voting rights, and the Klan first emerges and suppresses it. In the 1920s, there are surges in immigration in the United States. There's massive Klan membership that leads to legislation that bans, doesn't ban, but greatly restricts immigration to the United States. Once again, when there are voting rights decisions by the Supreme Court, the Klan emerges. And in all these cases, in the eyes of the white supremacists, they saw themselves as defending the previous social system. They did not see themselves as revolutionaries, but rather as individuals who are simply champions of the system as it was. During this time, we saw mob violence. We also saw a large amount of violence against individuals in the United States, lynching, but usually not what we would today call kind of spectacular acts of terrorism. The idea of individuals going in and simply spraying a Black church with bullets. It was a different kind of violence. But what we started to see due to both social changes and government crackdowns on groups like the Klan and many others that the government itself became the enemy. If you ask many white supremacists in the 1950s, they would say that governments around the world were on their side, and perhaps unfortunately, they would be right. But as governments begin to enforce civil rights, they start to see the state itself as captured. So in some cases, it's captured by Jews. In other cases, there's other voices of conspiracy. But you start to see a very strong revolutionary anti-system effort in place. There's also a shift in the broader conservative movement. So in many countries, you have conservative politicians who espouse traditional values, but are also denouncing racism. And so they will campaign against openly racist candidates. When some individuals within a political party make a racist statement, they're often shunned by the party. You have an effort by civil society groups to highlight individuals who are politicians and shame them. And as a result, they're often not backed by their parties. And so this is, again, a tremendous shift. So this also pushes many people towards radical extremes because the traditional political system is no longer welcoming them. So as we enter, I would say, the current era, one thing that makes this subject very difficult to study, but also very interesting to study, and here my work overlaps with that of Barbara and others, is it's very hard to say where the white supremacist movement begins and where it ends. That there's been emerging with anti-government groups in the United States. There is very strong militia, or what they would call themselves patriot groups, that are tremendously concerned about gun control and the overreach of the federal government. Strange things start to occur. So there was a terrorist named the Unabomber that was essentially anti-technology and lived in a remote cabin in the United States and was sending bombs to scientists. He's resurrected as a someone who champions a rural, traditional, anti-Jewish life, even though he himself was not about those values explicitly. So you start to see people from the past be recharacterized. You have conspiracy movements like QAnon, and you have male supremacist tendencies like the incel movement. And all these are overlapping in different ways with the white supremacist movement. This gives the movement's ideas a lot more reach. So you'll see anti-government types that in the past were concerned about the governments being too strong. Now they're concerned about the government being too strong because that means it's going to impose Black rule on the United States. So you start to see racist concerns and anti-government concerns meld together. One of the best analyses of the January 6th violence in the United States said that it's really hard to describe who showed up because you had so many different types of extremists show up. And it's hard to have kind of one label for all of them because you have lots of different causes showing up in the name of, in their eyes, defending the presidency of President Trump. As this kind of mixing of different ideas suggests, this movement is tapping into a broad set of political concerns. One of the biggest is a sense of white grievance. And there are massive political changes and especially demographic changes in many countries around the world. This is happening throughout Europe, it's happening in Australia and New Zealand, and it's happening in the United States. And there are different ways you can, I'll say, interpret the statistics, but the United States has a much greater minority population, non-white population, than it did in the past. And we see this happening also in many parts of Europe as well. And so there's a tremendous concern about immigration and demographics. And I would say in Europe especially, immigration is the dominant concern. And this is often a traditional concern about whether immigrant groups can assimilate. There are economic concerns about competition for jobs. But after 9/11, there was also a national security concern. There was a sense that individuals from Muslim countries were a national security threat. And all this got bound together. Making this even more complex is there are broader political currents that in the past used to be more likely to reject white supremacists that are now overlapping with them. So in the United States, you have criticism of things like being woke, the idea that you are defending minority positions to an extreme and almost silly point of view, that efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion are effectively efforts to penalize white people. You have a demonization of a relatively minor movement called Antifa, an anti-fascist movement in the United States, and it's made into this kind of giant bogeyman. And all this is done not just on the white supremacist extreme side, but in very much mainstream media by mainstream politicians. And all this overlaps with traditional political discourse. In many European countries, of course, you get this with many right-wing political parties. And again, it varies by country, but you do have this often open anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment being voiced by politicians with considerable support. Another aspect of this movement that is of concern is its ties to law enforcement and military forces. At times, this can be overstated. Sometimes there's, I will say, a failure to recognize just how many veterans there are. So when people talk about veterans being present on January 6th, and it comes as a shock when that shouldn't be a surprise. But if you compare it to left-wing terrorism in the past or jihadist terrorism, those were causes and movements that were either anti-military or police, or at least had no sympathy for them. But many, in terms of the right-wing ideology, believe in the mission, if you will, of the military, of law enforcement. And there's far more overlap in this as well. And that increases the potential danger of this movement. However, for the last 10 minutes or so, I've been focusing on the danger of this movement. But let me highlight that it has many, many weaknesses. And I think these are often neglected when we think about the threat and also when we think about counterterrorism. So one weakness I'd like to highlight is that it doesn't have strong groups. And so when we think about the jihadist movement, for example, we could talk about Al-Qaeda, we could talk about ISIS, we could talk about a host of regional organizations in Africa or South Asia or the Middle East. With the white supremacists, you can name individual groups, Atom Waffen, for example, but they're pretty tiny and not terribly important given the overall size of the movement. A related problem for this movement is that it doesn't have strong leaders. This makes it, from a counterterrorism point of view, very hard to disrupt. You can't arrest a leader and in so doing cripple all the people underneath that leader. But it makes it very hard for the group to achieve anything. It's amorphous. It's often going in multiple directions at once, at times in contradictory directions. In the past, white supremacists were very successful in stopping civil rights, stopping immigration, and ensuring the subordination of minority groups. That's much harder to do if you don't have organization, if you don't have groups, if you don't have leadership. Another problem they have is that many of their operatives have a low level of skill. This is fairly common, right? There are relatively few people who are inherently trained in violence. But many of their people are not particularly competent. Often they can use firearms, which in the United States, they're quite available. But they often have problems building bombs. And as a result, they're often very easily penetrated by law enforcement and intelligence services. In the United States, one of the most common ways that the FBI penetrates these groups is for someone to show up and say, I can build a bomb. And the group is much more likely to take that person into their trust and as a result, expose its activities. Another problem they have is that many of the people involved in this movement are associated with criminal activity. And this is criminal activity outside the movement. So it could be credit card fraud. It could be assaulting their wife. It could be a host of activities that have individuals within it interact with law enforcement. And as a result, many of them are detected not because of political violence, but because they are caught trying to pass fraudulent money or counterfeit money. And as a result, they cut a deal with law enforcement and expose the individuals who are planning a terrorist attack. I would also add that the violence they use at times repels popular support and hurts the broader movement. The 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville really turned many Americans against this broader movement. It led to the collapse of several of the groups that were trying to organize it. The lawsuits were devastating. And so at times, open violence is a negative, even though, of course, it captures our attention. And I would also add that when we talk about the movement today, it's often hard to judge the level of violence that is associated with it. So, of course, the high-profile terrorist attacks, like the ones I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, are easy to measure and quite vivid. But what a lot of this movement was associated with was low-level violence against the minority community. So if you go back to Germany after the end of the Cold War, you had hundreds, even thousands of attacks on Muslim immigrants, on hostels that hosted immigrant communities. And much of this was low-level arson. It didn't kill anyone, but of course, it made life horrible for the communities involved. And that sort of violence often doesn't show up in our statistics. The statistics for much of this movement are incredibly bad. There are only a few countries that do even an adequate job of collecting. I would put the United Kingdom in one of the better categories, but there are many countries that simply don't collect information. And as a result, it's hard for scholars like us to judge the extent of the problem. And there may be an argument that some of the problem is actually getting better. So if you go back, say, 20 years ago, one of the biggest problems we would be talking about would be the violence of the skinhead movement. This was an exceptionally large movement. It begins in the UK, it spreads to Germany, spreads to the United States and in much of Europe. It's not particularly political, but it's very, very violent. But a lot of the violence consisted of 10 guys getting drunk in a pub and then finding the nearest minority who walked by and beating that person up. And so there's lots of assault, lots of low-level violence. And this movement largely collapses over time. And so much of that violence diminishes, and that's quite a success, even as we deal with very high-profile terrorist attacks. Let me shift a little bit and talk about the global dimensions of this movement. There's always been some degree of global identity with this movement. For example, when the white supremacist government of Rhodesia was trying to fight the liberation movement, you had hundreds, even thousands of individuals who volunteered to fight on behalf of the government. So you did have this transnational dimension for many years. But of course, there's been a real shift in globalization in the last 20 years. And that's had a huge impact on the white supremacist community. So, ideas that once were confined to particular countries are now discussed and debated throughout the broader white supremacist movement. So something that's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years is an idea called the Great Replacement that argues that government elites are deliberately trying to water down the white race through immigration and intermarriage. Often these elites are kind of part of a Jewish conspiracy. There's a whole host of variations. I personally wouldn't want to emphasize the Great Replacement too much. To me, this is simply the latest variant on a broader sense that white supremacists have had, that whites are under assault and there are secret plots against them, and there are, conspiracy theories going back, decades or even centuries that stress this point. But the fact that you have common names and very similar ideas showing up in multiple countries is quite striking. And you also see symbols showing up in multiple countries. The flag of the American Confederacy shows up in Europe in demonstrations. It shows up in Ottawa in anti-government demonstrations. These are countries that historically had nothing to do with the American South and the Civil War, yet the symbol is one of rebellion and that's quite potent. You have white supremacist speakers showing up around the world. This is something that is, I will say, is remarkable even in places where I at least would not think it belongs. And here I would emphasize Barbara's work rather than my own. But if you look at conspiracy theories and things like QAnon, there's a global audience for this. And it begins as a very US specific set of conspiracies. But it's something that spreads around the world, perhaps in ways that are surprising, but nevertheless suggest how globalized this discourse is. A second aspect of globalization is that there are common models of action. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned Anders Behring Breivik and his method of pretending to be a commando and going in guns blazing, issuing a manifesto that in his case he put on the internet, now you put on social media. That's spread around the world, and we see it show up in New Zealand, we see it show up in Germany, and we see it show up in the United States. And there's a common way of acting that not all white supremacists use, but is surprisingly frequent. But what I would stress that's quite different from the jihadist world, and I think a very important difference, is that the cooperation is actually quite limited. We don't see cells in one country playing a significant role in operations in another country. We don't have something equivalent to Al-Qaeda training camps where thousands of people, truly thousands, are going through to become more proficient. There isn't a haven around the world on a mass scale where leaders of white supremacist groups can organize and plot and are able to recruit, again, thousands of followers. So as much as I would worry and do worry about the global discourse, I think it's also important to note that the operations are far less globalized than their jihadist counterparts. It wouldn't be a talk in 2022 if we didn't talk about Russia. So let me briefly talk about Russia in this context. Russia historically has, or I shouldn't say historically, Russia in recent years has tried to promote extremes. So in the United States, it placed a bet on Donald Trump early in his candidacy because they saw him as a disruptor. But they also put a bet on a very left-wing candidate, Jill Stein, who did not achieve much of a following. But that idea that you would support someone on the right and someone on the left simultaneously is very much what Russia is willing to do. And there's a lot of indications of Russian involvement with white supremacist and right-wing voices. But it's very hard for me, at least, to understand the scale of this. It's often easy to look at examples and assume a broader pattern. But I'm not sure how massive this problem is, but it may be quite significant. A lot of this is done by actors who are tied to the Russian state, but not the Russian state itself. So oligarchs, for example, who are close to President Putin. We've seen attackers in Sweden who have received training in camps in Russia. We have biker gangs like the Night Wolves in Europe that have received Russian support. Also, political parties, especially in Europe, have received financial support from the Russian government. Russia has also incited on social media ways to try to stir up popular unrest. And one of those is by promoting racism and trying to encourage a sense of racial polarization. It's hard to know how Ukraine is going to change all this. Obviously, Russia will have even more desire to punish or stir up problems in the United States and Europe because of the government's support for Ukraine. But to balance that, Russia has probably less capability than it did a year ago. Part of this is there's been press reporting of aggressive efforts to curtail Russian intelligence and far more surveillance of existing Russian assets. So Russia's ability to kind of work with potential supporters is limited. Also, the Russian brand is damaged. 5 years ago, Russia had a brand of kind of muscular conservatism. It was promoting anti-gay Christian values in a very masculine sort of way. Their brand is damaged because they're suffering tremendous losses in the war in Ukraine. And one thing we've seen throughout the history of terrorism is that people like to back a winning group. Very few people are excited when there's a supporter who's having significant problems. And so there's a question to me of how much Russia can step up its support for violence or violent actors. Let me talk a little bit about social media now. As I think everyone on the session knows, social media is a cheap and very easy way to reach large numbers of people. In the past, terrorists of all kinds, but white supremacists too, had to have a printing press, which was expensive. If it had to be clandestine, it had to be concealed. They would churn out limited numbers of propaganda. They'd have to then manually distribute it to a relatively small group of people. And now any individual, including all of us, can reach the world with relative ease. So cheap mass distribution is rather staggering. It is, I would stress, despite some sensationalistic media stories, overall, this seems to be less of a case of an individual who goes on social media to learn about gardening, who all of a sudden ends up a Nazi after 20 YouTube videos. Rather, it tends to be individuals who are already somewhat racist, and it makes them much more political. It orients their pre-existing biases. It gives them a political mode of action. It often expands their biases. So they might come in being anti-Muslim, and after watching enough videos, they're also anti-Jewish. They're also anti-government, so it can expand them as well. And it's a very important way of helping a movement without leaders and without groups organize itself. That if you want to know what to do because you believe that the white race is under attack, you can go online and get a number of ideas, and you can often pick and choose what you want. And that's a tremendous advantage while to a movement that doesn't have groups telling its followers what to do. It's also difficult for many social media companies to act. I would stress a couple problems. One is that for the most part, there's not much government guidance on this, in contrast to the jihadist movement, where the governments are far more explicit about what is to be done. But also for social media companies, it's much easier for them to act if there is a specific group, if there's branded content, if there are things they can say that here are the characteristics of what we're trying to stop. On the other hand, the white supremacist and anti-government movements are so broad and vague that it's often very difficult to know where they begin and end. And that leads to a tremendous concern about over-banning. However, I would stress social media also has huge problems for white supremacist and other terrorist groups. One of the biggest is that it weakens established leaders. Right? That just as social media has enabled an array of political voices who are not tied to traditional political parties to become celebrities, it's done that in the extremist world as well. And it further fragments the movement. Leaders can't control the message. And as a result, you constantly have new ideas coming up, and you constantly have shifting priorities. Many of the individuals involved, I'd say almost all of them, have no training, and as a result, have no operational security. And so if they are planning violence or supporting violence, they're often giving away incriminating information quite openly and quite easy for governments to penetrate. Also, social media by design is a networked platform. So individuals have friends and followers, and this network can be used by government to trace the contours of a movement. They can see if there's a violent individual they detect, they can see who that person's friends and followers are and monitor their communications and contacts quite easily. Social media companies are more aggressive in going after white supremacists than in the past, but they still have quite a long way to go. If we went back really, a decade ago or so, or 7 or 8 years ago, the social media company response would be, "This is not our problem," right? They would say that we don't have to worry about this, and as a result, we're not going to take any action. And so you had things like if you typed in Heidi Beirich of then of the Southern Poverty Law Center talks about this. If you typed in like the word Jew, the autocomplete would be plot to take over the world. If you typed in Martin Luther King, the major search results would be from racist information sources. When you were on things like Twitter, if you were following one person who was a white supremacist extremist, it would suggest others, just as it would do the same as if you were following, scholars at ICCT, where it would suggest other scholars at ICCT, right? It's trying to find what you want and give you more of it. The social media companies began to change with jihadist groups after the 2015 Paris attacks, and they became far more aggressive on removing them. The Charlottesville impact had this as well, where it began to change things in 2017. In the past, PayPal, for example, would ignore requests to stop white supremacists from using their platform, then they became far more aggressive. The deplatforming of individuals has hurt these groups and movements, especially those with larger followings. But as I mentioned, there are problems. One, again, is it's hard to determine where a group begins and ends. But there's also a political cost. And this is a huge issue with the white supremacist and right-wing terrorism that was much less true in the jihadist world, where the social media companies are afraid if they take action against some of the individuals who are pushing anti-immigrant sentiment, for example, they're going to be overlapping with more mainstream politics. And a lot of the influence that the social media companies have that the white supremacists have is because they're in a broader ecosystem where many of their ideas are flourishing. Very, very briefly, I want to compare the jihadist and white supremacist world. So the jihadists at their peak, I should say, had a secure base. They had a robust training apparatus where they could take individuals who were relatively incompetent, didn't know how to use violence and make them quite lethal. And they were a coherent group that could try to detect the broader movement. The white supremacists today have none of these, right? They don't have a base, they don't have training, they're not a coherent group. However, and this is important, however, the jihadists at their peak in the United States and in Europe had very few supporters. And I don't just mean actual people who joined the group, I also mean individuals in the broader community who embrace significant parts of their agenda. So in the United States, for example, there was no American Muslim organization that was peacefully calling for the imposition of Sharia law. Right? So there was no kind of peaceful counterpart. However, there are many supporters in the United States of aspects of the violent right supremacist world, and this is true in Europe as well. So anti-immigrant sentiment, blatant racism, sense of misogyny, all these things have tremendous echoes in the broader political system. And as a result, much of what at least I worry about when it comes to terrorism is not just the death toll, but also the broader political and psychological effect. And to me, that's of greater concern because of this broader following in the political space. So let me briefly talk about counterterrorism. In the United States, under the Trump administration, this was a tremendous problem. The rhetoric of the president of the United States himself was seen as supportive of white supremacist and especially anti-government groups. And this was something that where we saw dramatic changes in some anti-government groups like the Oath Keepers that were very anti-government until 2016. And after the president's election, they really saw themselves as militias that were there to act on behalf of the president. We had a president whose own message was, it's very hard for me to describe, he was an anti-government president. So he was someone who, despite being in charge of law enforcement at the federal level, was often very critical of federal law enforcement. He talked about secret plots within the broader US government and a deep state. So you had the leader of the United States actively encouraging suspicion of the leadership as a community of the United States. For many law enforcement, this was very much a mixed message. So the idea was pushed that white supremacists are not a particularly big problem, that groups like Antifa are as big or bigger, which was and is clearly false. And also there was political criticism that anytime people talked about right-wing terrorism, they were actually secretly criticizing right-wing politics. And even though this label has been around for decades, it was often seen as politically toxic to use. To its credit, in many places, law enforcement acted on its own authority. Right? It didn't always need support from on high to act, but obviously there's going to be a limit if you're concerned about the political exposure of your work. This changed dramatically in the Biden administration. There was a national strategy put out, far more research resources. There was an effort to identify extremism in the US military. These sorts of changes take years, if not longer, but there's certainly been progress. A lot of this is linked to overlap with the January 6, 2021 investigations in the United States, where you had the largest investigation in FBI history You have almost 1,000 prosecutions so far. And many of these individuals are linked to broader extremist causes. And in general, the more organized parts of this movement are trying to lie low. They're afraid of exposure because of this massive investigation. And the government has been very effective in penetrating these organizations and the movement, in part using social media. A lot of this is more about anti-government extremism than white supremacist violence. I would stress the point that there's tremendous overlap here, but the focus after January 6th has been on this anti-government side. And that's something that is, to watch, is to see how much this movement embraces the anti-government themes over the white supremacist ones. To say a few things on change, I would say that in general, law enforcement efforts go a very long way, but they have to be resourced. You need a large number of people, and you need to sustain them for many years. And part of the reason that this goes so far is that this is a very open movement, right? For the most part, it's not particularly clandestine and relatively easy to penetrate. So you don't need the most advanced intelligence techniques to go after it, because it doesn't have international bases. The whole apparatus that was used to go after Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan is far less necessary, but you do need sustained resourcing. The military and police are tremendously important institutions, both in terms of obviously the capacity for violence, but also in terms of social trust. Citizens have to be able to trust their militaries, have to be able to trust their police. And it's vital to ensure that these are effectively screened. Because there are global dimensions, you need global cooperation. Here I would commend the Trump administration for listing the Russian imperial movement as a foreign terrorist organization for the United States. That was a very important step. We've seen Canada, we've seen the United Kingdom, we've seen other countries that have listed white supremacist and right-wing groups as well. And there needs to be more of that, in my view. And when we talked about information sharing, it needs to go both directions, where the United States needs to be giving information as well as receiving it from around the world. Social media companies need to be more aggressive about deplatforming white supremacists. And I would say this is especially true when you go outside the English-speaking world. There's the vast majority of attention in the social media space is in the English-speaking content, and the problems are often much bigger outside it. They need to identify a wider range of dangerous organizations, draw a list from other countries. But the last thing I would name, and here I'll stop, is that conservative leaders need to vehemently reject any violence and violent actors, that we need to put a sanitary cordon around mainstream politics. And the idea that, yes, people could have at times quite heated discussions about immigration, but no one can support violence. No one can be demonizing the individuals as somehow deserving of violence. And this is, to me, an obvious and important change, but one that I would love to have some ideas on how to get there, but I don't. I think politics and political discourse has declined, and ideas that I once thought of as outside the mainstream and unacceptable are now more regularly debated and discussed. And you have people who openly believe kind of crazy conspiracy theories that are having positions of authority in many countries. And so the broader political discourse, to me, is the key to ensuring that the political influence of this movement is limited. But the world really is moving in the wrong direction. So on that pessimistic note, let me stop, and I look forward to Barbara's thoughts and to comments in general.
Thanks so much for such an insightful review of the book. It's certainly timely, a very important contribution to the field and many fields, because nowadays, we've mentioned before, and you really stressed, you don't really know where ideologies such as white supremacism begin or where they end. So there's a lot of intersection of ideas and cross-pollination that really, questions even the way we use categories and we frame the research question, or even prevention practices, intervention practices, which are mostly based on how we, define terms like that. So, which are very relevant and crucial to, first of all, identify the threat. So this is very interesting, but also very complicated, very complex times for sure. So I don't know if I see questions. Let me just check the chat. I haven't seen any questions yet. So please, I would ask the participants to share any thoughts or questions they might have. Otherwise, I'll start abusing my power and throw a couple of questions to see if we can start the debate. So yeah, I don't see anything yet. So I'll begin the discussion if that's okay. And hopefully more people will join us in talking about this interesting book. All right, so you really stressed the idea that, you know, you were looking at a threat that is loose, leaderless, sort of like not totally cohesive. It doesn't look very consistent. So it makes it hard even talking about groups. You know, you don't really know who you're looking at, even when we talk about online radicalization and online threats. You're looking into maybe users that are not necessarily connected. You look at networks that might not have, you know, a common umbrella that makes sense of all their thinking, or an agenda that their actions or narratives might point at. So you're saying that this makes it difficult for law enforcement, for example, to tackle the threat, as opposed to, you know, more systematic action against, say, Islamization, quote unquote, or Islamic threats. So I was wondering if this is all it, or do you think there's still a bias towards, you know, more easily identifying Islamic threats rather than really tackling and confronting what we would define as far-right threats? That's a first question. If you would like to address it first, and then I have more, unless we have more questions on the chat.
No, that's an excellent question, and I'm glad you raised it because there's definitely a bias. Right. So I do think the challenges of jihadists versus far right are different and have different issues for law enforcement. But there's no question that the bias shows up in multiple ways. One is simply how many people conceptualize the threat. Right, the jihadists are seen as extreme. They are seen as having a radical agenda, but the agenda of the white supremacists is often viewed, if not always with sympathy, at least with some understanding. There's a sense that they are not opposed to the system. If you look at the U.S. response, for example, to January 6th, right? It's hard to imagine that if there were, you know, a group of, you know, I'll say ISIS sympathetic Americans said, let's have a rally on January 6, 2021 in front of the Capitol, some of them saying we'll bring guns. It's hard to imagine that the response would not have been dramatically different with large scale arrests and extremely large police presence. But many of the individuals involved on the law enforcement side talk about how they thought these people are kind of our friends. Right, many of them are saying we support law enforcement. We're skeptical of things like the Black Lives Matter movement, which is seen as anti-police rather than a pro-civil rights movement. And so there's an entire interpretation of a lot of this cause that is many people in authority are more sympathetic to. And that shows up in resourcing, that shows up in the immediate response of the individuals. It shows up in media coverage where you're far more likely to hear that a white supremacist was mentally ill in contrast to a jihadist. I would just add as an aside, I worry actually about the opposite problem, which is there is significant mental illness among attackers, but that's true also on the jihadist side. So I think sometimes the mental health solutions to me are actually very important to consider. We just need to recognize that it's not something that is unique to one community, but shows up across many of these individuals where there are significant problems. But the bias is quite real. And in the United States, perhaps it diminished at the federal level after January 6th. It was such a jolt to the American system. It was such a shock to see this sort of, I'll say, kind of direct assault on democracy. But I'm sure that's less true at the local level, where in the United States you have a lot more variation. I suspect it's less true at the European level, again, because in many countries there wasn't that action that was kind of a direct assault on the symbols of a particular country. It's very difficult, as people on this discussion know, to talk about Europe because there's such variation within Europe, right? What the problem in Greece and Italy is quite different than the problem in Sweden and the UK. But also there, you do see tremendous bias where there are far more resources dedicated to the jihadist problem for the most part even in countries like Germany that historically have had huge problems with this movement.
Thank you. So we have two questions on the queue, three questions actually. First, I'll give the floor to ICC's director, Thomas Renach. You had a question?
Yeah, I mean, thanks a lot, Dan, for your presentation. Like, fascinating talk, fascinating insights into the threat, and also some ideas about how to respond to it. I've got a million questions, but I'll try to narrow down to one, or potentially with two aspects to it. But I think because, like, in sort of the painting or the picture that you started to paint with the spectrum of right-wing extremism and anti-government extremism in all of its different configurations, I think one of the key challenges, I think, that we're confronted with is the fact that if we leave aside the clearly violent terrorist side of it, which is obviously the easy one to problematize, then we're left with a whole range of ideas, and I will not call them ideologies, but ideas that, for at least some of them, gather relatively significant support among the population, at least if we trust some of the polls that have been done in the US and in several European countries with regard to the support to certain conspiracy ideas and other type of ideas. So basically, the question would be, like, where do we draw the line between what is acceptable form of extremism, basically something we don't agree with, but in a way should tolerate in a liberal democratic society, as opposed to non-acceptable form of extremism. And obviously there is an easy answer to that, but I also want to put that in the perspective that if we look at the evolution of counterterrorism and counter-extremism legislation in most Western countries, we see that we have broadened the focus and broadened the scope of what we consider as illegal. So if you want to say, well, basically the line is like respect of the law, then basically we should also acknowledge that there's been a broadening of that spectrum, which so far we seem more eager to apply for jihadi extremism and terrorism, as opposed to right-wing extremism and anti-government extremism, with the caveat that if we start to go down that line, then we should also realize and recognize all the potentially counterproductive effects of these policies, which we gladly ignored as long as we were like sort of targeting a minority, but which might become more obvious when we are targeting a broader segment of the population, particularly in times where anti-government sentiments are particularly strong. And so basically targeting that population might actually further exacerbate those. So I wanted to pick your brain on that. And I had another question, but I think that's a long enough one and complex enough that I will leave it here. Thanks.
Unfortunately, I'm going to probably talk a lot, yet not give a clear answer to your question. It's one that touches a lot of different areas, and to me is really at the heart of politics today. I'll say two things to begin with. One is that as an American, I often come really from, I'll say, from an international point of view, from one extreme end of the spectrum, which is the American First Amendment is far more permissive of speech and political activity than is true in really every other kind of established liberal democracy, where there's much more toleration of political activity that would be banned in many countries. So an easy, I'll say, first level division is simply toleration and support for violence, right? Anything on the wrong side of that line is easy to go against. But to me, you get very difficult questions when you start to talk about organized political movements. So I would look at Golden Dawn in Greece and say that's a movement that tolerates and supports violence. And I have no problem with efforts to try to outlaw or remove it. The National Front in France, and I'm not an expert on France, but my understanding is it's a movement that often has extreme views, but is not calling for violence as part of its political platform, even though many members may support it. And that question to me is really the big one, which is how do we feel about political parties that have extreme agendas but are using peaceful means to achieve? And it's very troubling for me as a citizen when this happens. And my hope is that democratic processes can effectively counter this. And there is some evidence, although it's a bit mixed, that when you have movements like the National Front, it can actually reduce support for the most extreme positions because people have a political means to channel their opinions. So if you're in France as opposed to Sweden, there are significant anti-immigrant political parties you can support. And as a result, you don't have to turn to the most extreme. But when you are allowing or even perhaps encouraging this sort of political activity, it has tremendous political consequences. So, part of the reason the Klan collapses in the United States in the 1920s is that there's anti-immigrant legislation passed that's quite consequential. So, in a way, the political system worked, right? You had peaceful politics that made the most extreme kind of remove some of the cause from the most extreme, but it had tremendous negative consequences for the country, and I would even argue for the world. And do we want strong racist parties? And I think I tend to be very against banning things, and that maybe again be my kind of American bias on this. But the subject makes me very uncomfortable. And to go to your last point, this does show up when you talk about proposals to target terrorist groups, where you do get very different answers depending on whether you're talking about a jihadist group that's seen as really having no support and a right-wing group that has much broader support. And under President Trump, this was an issue in the United States when people talked about creating domestic terrorism statutes because there were fears that the president would use them to go after political opponents. And this is something that has not been done in recent years in the United States, but certainly the possibility is there. So I do worry about the effect on suppressing discourse, including what I feel is legitimate discourse. And so overall, I tend to err on the side of permissibility. But the system right now is not working well in terms of marginalizing the most extreme voices. Right? There's a political market for this. There's a media market for this. And my hope that calmer voices, rational voices, more frankly, kind of loving and inclusive voices would triumph has not been true in the last 10 years. And that's of great concern to me.
So we have a few questions on the chat. I'm not sure if that we'll have time to address them all, so I'll try to be as fair as possible to our participants. So I'll bring up the first question, which is about right-wing extremism in non-Western countries. So does it exist, and does it pose a security threat that perhaps a lot is comparable to how you view the threat in the West, quote unquote?
So the answer is certainly yes, and very strongly yes. So part of this is a definitional question, right? So if we say white supremacist, obviously that's not going to apply to countries that, for example, don't have large white populations. But if we simply say the supremacy of one racial community, right, that shows up unfortunately around the world. And there'll be different contexts culturally where it shows up, but the idea that some communities that have strong positions in the political and social structure want to preserve that and are willing to use violence to do so, very, very common. When we go outside what we usually call Western countries, even though somehow Australia and New Zealand seem to show up in that list. It also applies in other countries with large white populations. Russia actually has a huge problem with white supremacist and right-wing terrorism. This was at times encouraged under President Putin, and then when things were getting a bit out of control, he clamped down pretty hard. But tremendous violence against racial minorities within Russia. A large neo-Nazi movement, the historical irony of which is immense, but nevertheless quite real. So we certainly do see this show up and posing a security threat in terms of killing people and also a political threat.
Thank you. So we have a very interesting question about, I guess, internal and generic biases against certain populations. So I read, if the ideology of white supremacy appeals to internal biases, how can the problem of complicity amongst general Western populations against racism and lower level activity really be tackled in your view?
So I will say, before we get pessimistic, there has been tremendous progress in many countries, right? So in the United States, the country I know best, I'll use as an example, where when in 1967, when the Supreme Court decided to allow interracial marriage, the vast majority of Americans were against it. Right? They thought it was wrong. Now the overwhelming majority are for it. There is progress in a host of issues like that in terms of toleration of other religions, and otherwise a real effort, and not effort's the wrong word, real success on things like gay rights. There are things that were, frankly, undiscussable 40, 50 years ago that are now at times law, or at the very least being discussed. So a lot of, I'll say, the grievances of this movement are based in reality, in that there is a much more welcoming environment for racial minorities, for immigrants, for the LGBTQ community. And to me, that's a good thing. And this is something that shows that society, while for all its problems, has often moved in the right direction. It's very, very hard to change this, though, on a mass scale without, I'll say, broad government efforts. And so you want, to me, the big key is the education system. That's one of the few things that can reach millions of people in a sustained way. But even then, the education system often fails. I would have thought the education system would have succeeded in, explaining to people that conspiracy theories aren't real, and that, basic critical thinking skills show how absurd they are. And obviously that's not true. But you want government investment in trying to isolate these ideas. As I mentioned before, you very much want people on both sides of the political spectrum to be rejecting it. It's far more convincing when a conservative rejects racism than when a liberal does. And this is something, to me, that, the most effective anti-communists were liberals, to me, not conservatives, for that reason, is people who can say, look, I'm sympathetic to certain ideas, but, there are also lines that we need to draw and respect. And so you want to elevate those voices when possible. But again, it's very hard to have deliberate government policy on this when there is broad support for at least some of these ideas. The politics mess up the programs, and in practice, they often don't work too well.
So speaking of having institutions that help create, say, media literacy, or maybe identify information that is non-evidence-based, for example, conspiracy theories, as we've seen very much normalized in the last couple of years, especially in the context of lockdown, etc. There's a question regarding the role of media. So I read, how should mainstream media deal with the extreme positions of some politicians that incite populations, and I would add, engage with normalized conspiracy theories to undermine certain groups, or even sympathize with more extreme groups? Should they confront them, engage in debate, or not offer them a podium at all? Is the question.
So I would say there are kind of two answers to the same question. So ideally, the media would not amplify this. And if this is just a small thing on social media or otherwise not getting attention, it would be great if it were the neglect continued. But once it becomes a real thing, it is a genuine news item. It needs to be addressed by the media. Having said that, I'll say, we could talk about the media as if its primary interest were news and reporting. But of course, a lot of the media is simply a news version of a business. And they're trying to have stories, perhaps with high degree of ethical standards, but they're trying to have stories that people read and pay attention to. And as a result, they're likely to go for more dramatic ones or flamboyant ones. And conspiracy theories certainly fall into this category. And this shows up in a lot of different contexts. There's a television show in the United States called Animal Planet. And this is something that, as you could guess by the title, is about animals. But I think its best-selling show was about the plot to destroy mermaids. And one of the suspects was the US Navy. And this is, not a kind of violent conspiracy theory, but this was simply a show that was trying to get a broader audience. And understandably, media are trying to get a broader audience. And if they don't, it's a very competitive media environment. So there'll be other media voices that are playing this up, even if responsible media do not play it up. And therefore, it's very hard to avoid this. So in the end, I think engagement is going to be more necessary. But there are problems with this, right? So one of the things that make people more likely to believe a conspiracy theory is if they hear it multiple times. So it's not evidence for or evidence against, it's simply hearing it again and again makes people more likely to believe it. So when these ideas are amplified in the media, even if people are trying to debunk them or show them in a negative light, often it can increase support for them, increase belief for them. And so to me, this is a real concern. And I think because we rely very heavily on competitive media environments in general, it's going to be very hard to be able to have the media go one direction or the other. In the end, there's going to be very heavy coverage of this.
Thank you. So a question about lessons learned, I guess, is there anything in trying to tackle white supremacist violence or even white supremacist ideologies that is transposable to different contexts? And I'll maybe rephrase this, perhaps not, I'm not sure if I'm being fair, but I would also add, perhaps that's the way to put it. There's a lot that's been done prior to the focus being on far-right extremism that's been sort of like the idea of not reinventing the wheel. So if something worked in the past to tackle jihadism, maybe we can sort of like use those structures to tackle new threats. And so I guess the question is asking you the other way around as well. Is there anything that's been done now that worked and we can use in different contexts? Or perhaps the person was referring to context in terms of geographical context, not clear, but yeah, to make it more complex.
Sure. Well, let me highlight a few things that I think work well. One, as I mentioned, if law enforcement is properly resourced, this movement is incredibly vulnerable. The violent side of the movement. They're used to accepting a degree of social tolerance, which means much of their activity is open. They don't have kind of havens where they can hide if pressure grows. So fairly basic but well-resourced law enforcement efforts can often greatly diminish this. I would also add that cooperation is incredibly important. This is true across Europe. This is true between European countries and the United States, that often you have individuals who are inspiring or otherwise encouraging from one country, and you want that global sharing. And we really want to make sure this movement doesn't become even more transnational, especially in operations. Social media companies got much better going after jihadists. They're certainly not perfect, but when you compare the presence of groups like ISIS and on social media in 2015 to 2022, it's really a dramatic difference. It's really night and day. And so having social media companies go after this is something that, to me, I think could be far more effective. None of these, in my mind, are revolutionary steps. These are all fairly straightforward, fairly basic, but I do feel they're effective.
Thank you. So there's a question about foreign fighters and individuals going to territories where there's conflict to essentially gain some training experience. So I'll read the question so that I don't misread anything. Given the relative lack of skill and access to training available among sympathizers to right-wing extremism, what could or should Western governments be doing to prevent or discourage travel to Russia or Ukraine to gain that type of experience?
Like many people, I was very concerned when the Ukraine war broke out that this would strengthen the white supremacist and far-right cause. We had already a number of individuals who had been active in Ukraine after the 2014, I'll say Russian-backed efforts there, and you had fighting of individuals on both sides of the conflict, really, on the pro-Russia and pro-Ukraine side. And there was concern that Ukraine would be a training ground. I would say here, I actually think there's a bit of good news. So in contrast to the jihadist world, those going to fight on the Ukrainian side are subject to some degree of vetting where the Ukrainian government is monitoring them, but it's also putting them under its command and control, so they're not off doing their own thing. And in general, the Ukraine narrative doesn't really neatly fit the white supremacist narrative. The invader is another white country. In fact, it's one that champions kind of a white Christian nationalism. The head of Ukraine is a Russian-speaking Jew. So the idea of kind of a clear-cut good versus bad white supremacist view isn't neatly mapped onto the Ukraine. You certainly still have some individuals going. There's no question about that. I would say governments want to do a few things about that. One is ideally you stop it. And this is my, my general view, which is I'm not a believer in privatized war. If the United States or the United Kingdom or the Netherlands or another government wants to be engaged, that's a government decision. You don't allow your citizens to volunteer to fight. You take action as a government, and I against privatized war. If individuals go anyway and you don't stop them, you want to monitor them. You want to know who they're meeting, what they're learning, what their plans are, and treat them as potential threats, even though the foreign fighter jihadist experience suggests that the vast majority will not be. But even if a few are, it's of grave concern. And you especially want to stop people going to Russia. Obviously, the Russian government hostility is likely to continue, even if the Ukraine conflict were magically stopped right now. And so that potential danger from individuals who are inspired or controlled or somehow linked to Russia is something to watch for the long term. And so this is something that I think intelligence services should be investing in.
Thank you. So one of our participants would like you, if possible, to elaborate on the financial side of things. So you mentioned just briefly that white supremacists might be financed through crowdfunding or even PayPal. So how do they do it? What can you tell us about this? And is it a problem to the platform then because of the fuzzy limits, I quote, between groups / individuals with extreme or extremist groups, but legitimate political opinion, and I would add legitimate ways to raise money, actually?
So there's a lot of variation in terms of how these individuals raise money. And here I would stress the decentralized nature of the movement. Right, so the majority of these are small groups at best, or individuals. And often if it's individuals, it's simply someone who is financing themselves. They may have a job, they may spend years collecting weapons, use their own credit cards to rent a truck or whatever it is. And sometimes small groups are variations on that, where individuals pool their resources to do so. Sometimes, as you mentioned, Barbara, it's crowdfunded. But often it's kind of a bottom-up individuals doing things in contrast to the jihadist world, where you had large numbers of individuals who were getting funding from formal groups that had budgets and everything like that. What was interesting when you look at the Ottawa demonstrations in Canada was that a lot of the money came from the United States. That there was this kind of sense of donation for the broader cause. And so, again, what makes this difficult is the linkage and overlap between legal and non-legal activities. where, supporting protest, right? If someone in the United States gave money to support protesters in Iran right now who are demonstrating against the regime's abuses, I think that's great, right? And so a conservative sense that, donating to anti-government protests about COVID restrictions in Canada, although I disagree with that, I can't say that that's something that is a different kind of activity, even though one cause I strongly agree with, and the other cause I strongly disagree with. In most cases, when you have that sort of funding, individuals are not openly advertising their violence. They might be advertising their extremism, but they're not advertising their violence. But it's not the kind of sustained funding that we saw in the jihadist world. There's not the kind of massive sustained charity efforts that Al-Qaeda helped create. There's not the taxation that the Islamic State used when it controlled parts of Syria. And in general, many of these groups are actually quite poorly funded. And this goes back to the problem with crime that they have. Many of the individuals turn to crime to raise money, and it might, again, be rather simple crime, right? It could be credit card fraud. It could be, robbing a local store. But that's actually a tremendous vulnerability because it exposes the individuals to law enforcement, not because of political violence, but just because of day-to-day crime. But there are tens of thousands of law enforcement personnel focused on crime rather than political violence. And so when you're engaging that broader community, that's a tremendous vulnerability to this movement. You do want to try to encourage payment processors like PayPal to be judicious in who uses their services. And so under US law, PayPal could not, the US government could not tell PayPal, don't process the payment of Nazis, right? If it's not violent, but it's hateful, the US government cannot prohibit that. But it is something that civil society can put pressure on, right? These companies don't just respond to government, they respond to civil society pressure. It's something that other governments with fewer restrictions can also encourage. So I do think you want to go after the apparatus and processors around the world as well.
Thank you. And perhaps the last question, a participant would like to know about the alt-right movement and what happened to it. Is it gaining strength? Is it not? And I might add that before COVID-19, it was something that everyone who was looking at the far right was talking about. And then it is true that during COVID, with all of this intersection of ideologies and sort of like expansion and amplification of these ideas online, they sort of lost presence. So is this actually true?
As you know, the alt-right begins as a kind of provocative challenge to the traditional right. And it is something that's, in their eyes saying, look, we're not trying to be politically correct as our fellow conservatives are. So it's much more anti-immigrant at a time when many Republicans in the United States are trying to win over immigrant voters. In general, it is often very young, often using humor, and it's able to try to change the discourse. And I actually think it's succeeded for the most part. And part of its undoing is because these ideas are much more, I'll say, acceptable in the broader discourse, really around the world. And part of what makes it harder in the United States is we see this in a much more mainstream way. So it's not really the alt-right as much. One of the big things that happens with COVID and then the defeat of President Trump is two big issues start to dominate a lot of the discourse. One is COVID restrictions, and one is what President Trump supporters would call the stolen election. And these are things that are discussed really endlessly by, for example, Tucker Carlson, the Fox News media host, who is, often the most, but at times one of the most popular voices in the media in the world. We see this show up among the leading accounts on Facebook, leading political accounts on Facebook that are pushing these ideas. So I think a lot of the alt-right declines, but it's a victory because so much of what they were pushing has migrated towards more traditional conservative spaces where you have, the large number of individuals who are running for office for the Republican Party believed the election was stolen from President Trump, which I think many of them know was a false belief. But that sort of thing would have been an alt-right perspective 5 or 6 years ago. We would have kind of put it in a very different category. When we talk about COVID restrictions and excessive government, that's something the alt-right would have talked about. Now it's much more mainstream. So I think there's been a shift in discourse that's really empowered this broader movement, even though some of the individuals who were its early champions are less important.
So maybe we can end about any thoughts about precisely this, the normalization of hatred and conspiracy theories and disinformation that almost responds to what you were saying, right? The alt-right's meta-political goals about changing sort of like our view of what's truth and what's not truth. Post-truth world, some talk about. So perhaps you can give a couple of last words on that, and then we should be done.
I have thought about this issue a lot, and unfortunately, I think it's defeated me, where the things that I believe in, which is rational discourse, the idea of experts informing that discourse, are increasingly out of favor. And you have a sense of militancy, you have polarization that has increased. You have ideas that are entering the discourse that are blatantly false, yet are not corrected, and are indeed kind of gleefully championed by people. So I don't have good answers to me, that very central and big question. The only thing I'll say, so we don't end on such a depressing note, is it puts greater responsibility on all of us, right? That we as individuals, as citizens really, can't simply say, well, that's too bad. We have to take action, and that's, to me, political action, and that's engagement in ideas, that's disagreeing openly when people push false or hateful ideas. It is supporting politicians who are arguing for responsible positions. And that is, to me, necessary more than ever because of the decline of traditional political discourse.
Well, thanks for the lighter note to end this event. Thanks so much, Professor Daniel Byman, for for sharing with us what it is an amazing contribution to the field, and I'm sure that the participants would agree. Thanks a lot for everyone who attended this event and for the questions and insights. I'll just end by reminding you all that you can perhaps help us improve the quality of this and future events by replying to the short survey. And again, thanks so much, Professor Byman, for everything, and hopefully our paths will cross again soon.
Thank you very much.
Take good care. Bye.